I've got 2 minutes after the hour, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'll do a quick introduction here to the series, and then we'll get on with kind of today's topic. So today's session is the first of five webinars we're going to offer this winter, one a month, looking at just some different ag econ related topics that are either going on in the department or with some of the partners that we work with somewhat regularly. So after today, January 10th, will be our next webinar, and we're going to have Janet Smith with FSA discussing a little bit about record keeping and how that is helpful for profitability of operations. In February, we'll have a couple folks, George Haynes discussing agricultural outlook, and Jim Auer from the Montana Department of Ag talking about some of the support that's available for local food businesses. In March, we'll talk a little bit with Madeline Mason with NRCS and about some of the climate resilient programs they have going, as well as a cattle market outlook from Caitlin McCulloch from the Livestock Marketing Information Center. So those are kind of the next few months coming up. Today's, we're going to have two presenters. First will be Dr. Yang Yu, who is a faculty member here in MSU's Department of Agricultural Economics and Economics. Joined us from after doing his graduate work at Penn State, joined us in 2020. And then our second speaker today will be Professor Emeritus from our department, Dr. Vincent Smith. So please send in questions via chat as we go, and then after each speaker finishes, we'll have an opportunity if you'd like to ask some questions as well. So Yang, thank you for presenting, and I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Joe. I will just start sharing my screen here. Okay,
Looks good on my end.
All right, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about the milk date labeling in Montana. I presented another talk in November, and I was a little bit more focused on consumer side and food waste reduction, and I heard a lot of feedbacks from production side, and folks are concerned about if this kind of regulation change would have negative impact on them. So today I'm going to add a little bit more about the implications for producer side. So I'm going to first introduce a little bit background on our state's milk labeling laws, in particular the sell-by-date laws. And I'm going to spend a couple minutes talking about consumer implications. Then I'm going to spend maybe 5 or 6 minutes for implications for producers. And I will talk separately for different types of producers like retailers, processors, and farms. So let's get started on the background of this milk sell-by-date regulation in Montana. So this is something we call the 12-day rule. So basically, if we have a pasteurized fluid milk sold in Montana, it has to be sold within 12 days after the pasteurization. And I'm talking about like regularly pasteurized milk, not ultra pasteurized milk. For ultra pasteurized milk, they could have a sell-by-date that's like 2 months after pasteurization. So we have this rule adopted in 1980. Then it kind of stays there, doesn't change. So it's been like 43 years. And recently, I think starting in 2010, we had a lot of efforts to repeal this rule. And we had lawsuits filed by out-of-state milk distributors and some small grocery retailers try to repeal this rule. And we also had bills introduced in Montana State Legislature. Sorry, this should be 2015, not 2025, and 2017. But those bills didn't proceed. And I recently heard there is active discussion in the legislature again. So I think probably we should have some timely discussion of this topic. So as you see those efforts are trying to repeal this law. And basically, if we repeal this law, we would have a longer sell-by-date because the 12-day rule was considered too strict. Now, It's important for us to understand what's the rationale behind those courts for repealing this rule. Now, first, there are three different rationales, but let's start with the first one. So this rule was adopted in 1980. So it doesn't reflect the technological development we had in the past 4 decades. Okay? Because back then, we had different technologies, processing, transportation, distribution, and even for inventory and storage. But those technologies have improved a lot in the past 4 decades. And as a result, we see that other states have updated their regulation. So I would note that there is no federal level regulation at all. So the federal government doesn't regulate milk sell-by dates. It's all up to the states. And currently, Montana has the shortest milk shelf life in the US because all other states either abandoned this kind of regulation or they have extended sell-by dates. So this table that I show here comes from one of the papers I wrote in and published in Food Policy. So this is an example of recent changes that we see in other states. And I would say right now in the United States, we only have maybe 3 states that have explicit rules, like we have to set an explicit date for sell-by regulation. And Montana has a 12-day rule, and Pennsylvania has a 17 days rule, and Maryland has 18 days rule. So these are the only 3 states that I know of in the United States that have an explicit sell-by date. All other states doesn't have regulation, but if you go to California, they don't have this regulation, but you still see a sell-by date or use by date printed on the milk cartons. And those dates are printed by the manufacturers. So milk distributors could choose what kind of sell-by date they want to put on the milk carton. And it's typically much longer than 12 days. So the second rationale for calling for longer sell-by or just repeal this 12-day rule was that it leads to more wasted milk, not just at the consumer level, but also at the retail level. So USDA has this loss-adjusted food availability data that they try to measure how much food is wasted at consumer level and retail level, like supermarkets. And they find that consumers would waste 20%, and the retailers would waste 12% of all the milk produced in the US. And one of the big reasons behind those waste estimates are sell-by date regulation, especially if we are in a place with short sell-by date. And there is a lot of confusion over like interpretation of the sell-by date. A lot of consumers, more than 80% of the consumers, will just look at the sell-by date. And if it's past the sell-by date, they will just throw away this milk. They will pour the milk down the drain. And this is like a misunderstanding of what those date label means. In fact, they don't mean anything for food safety issues. They basically mean maybe an indicator for food quality, and a sell-by date doesn't mean a date for consumers. It means a date for retailers to sell the milk, but it's perfectly fine for consumers to drink the milk after that sell-by date, right? So that's the second reason. Now, third one, as a result of a short sell-by date, I mean, it adds to the cost of processing and transportation and storage. So retailers have to sell milk quickly. And if they have some milk left, there is no other way to use this. I mean, they just threw away the milk now. Maybe 10 years ago, I think in Montana, milk distributors would take back those expired milk because they are perfectly fine. So they will use milk for ice cream or cheese. But now they stopped doing that. So retailers would have no choice but to throw away. And those kind of costs will be transmitted to consumers. So eventually consumers are paying for a higher price. So if you look at this table here, I'm listing 2 examples where we can compare milk price in Montana with neighboring state. So for 1 gallon of milk sold in Safeway in Helena, Montana, it's asking for $4.19 a gallon, but for the same milk sold in the same retail, in Washington, it's asking for $3.19 a gallon. And same story happens for a comparison between Montana and Idaho. Okay, so Montana retailers would ask for $4.59 a gallon, but for the same milk, Idaho retailers would ask for a bit more than $2 a gallon. Now those numbers could change. This comes from a newspaper called Independent Record from Atlanta in 2015. But those numbers could change over time. Sometimes it gets smaller, sometimes it gets larger. But Montana's milk consumer price is consistently higher than those in Washington and Idaho. That's a matter of fact. So that's, as you can see, those rationales for repealing this law are basically focused on consumers, right? So consumers are paying for a higher price. They are wasting milk, which adds to their prices. But there are also pushbacks that try to keep this law. I mean, we had this legislature efforts and lawsuits, but they didn't succeed. So there are legitimate concerns from other parties that are worried that this law, the change of this law would negatively impact them. And I'm going to discuss these concerns in more detail later, but basically, concerns are focused on in-state milk distributors and Montana dairy farms. So I will discuss this later, but before that, I will talk a little bit more about implications for consumers. And I mean, it's pretty important for producers to understand what consumers' response would be if we repeal this law. I mean, consumers are the customers, that they buy our agricultural products. So, I mean, there are a lot of research on consumer behavior on their different sell-by dates. I have read at least 30 papers on this subject. And the consensus among economists is that a longer sell-by date would improve consumer welfare because it would lower the food waste and will typically provide consumers with lower price. And one of the papers I wrote in 2021 is that in New York City, when they repealed this type of sell-by regulation, what we find is consumers would purchase less milk if price remains the same. Now, this is pretty important. Price remains the same. And the reason behind this observation is that milk demand is inelastic. So people kind of stick to the quantity they buy. They don't respond to prices a lot, I mean, relatively speaking. So if the sell-by date is longer, they can utilize better of the milk they buy, so they don't need to buy that much milk. And price remains the same, happened in New York City because New York City is a pretty competitive market. Even before the repeal of the sell-by date regulation, the prices was already low. It was a competitive price. But it could be a different story in Montana because in Montana, we don't have that kind of level of competition. We have, if you look at New York State, it is a large dairy producing state. They have a lot of distributors, a lot of brands, and they try really hard to compete for the New York City market. But in Montana, we have like 2 large processors processing most of the milk in 3 large plants. So it's, I mean, in terms of level of competition, it's not as competitive as New York market. So what we would see in Montana is price might get lower after we repeal this regulation because there will be more competition coming into the state. And I will discuss this in more detail later. But the key here is if price drops substantially, it is possible for consumers to purchase more milk. It's just law of demand, economics 101. Because when things get cheaper, people will try to buy more. So it's, I mean, we don't know for sure if consumers will buy more or less because we don't know what's going to exactly happen to price. But there is a possibility that if price drops substantially lower, then consumers would buy more. So that, I mean, that's like the main picture researchers find for consumers' perspective. Now, there are some things that I heard from the consumers, like what happens to milk quality if we have a longer sell-by date? If we have 18 or 20 days of sell-by date, would that decrease the quality or the taste of milk? And a related question is whether rural consumers would receive fewer days of good milk because now milk stays longer in inventory in grocery stores. So when they purchase milk, there will be fewer days left for them. Now, food science research has shown that the quality of milk remains basically the same up to 18 to 20 days if the bottle is unopened. So today's technology would ensure you can still drink this high quality of milk even if you keep that for 20 days. And those research come from University of Wisconsin and Cornell University. And I mean, Wisconsin and New York are large dairy producing states. They do a lot of research on dairy. So the key here is the bottle is unopened. Okay, so if you have one bottle of milk that's 12 days past pasteurization, another bottle of milk that stays 18 days, both of them are unopened, then basically you will taste the same quality. But once you open the bottle, this is really when the milk the quality starts to degenerate. Okay, regardless how many days you have this milk in the refrigerator, once you open it, you have about a week to drink it. And that means the quality of milk really depends on whether the bottle has been opened or not depends on how many days you have on the shelf life. And I also received a question, like a comment about like the freshness or the taste of milk. I mean, food science has told us it doesn't matter a lot, but I mean, taste is pretty subjective matter, right? So some people will taste milk different. Like after I moved in Montana, I buy more milk. I find myself drinking more milk because Montana milk tastes better. But I'm not entirely sure if it's because of the short sell-by date. Maybe it's just Montana cows. They produce better milk. And I intentionally keep the milk that I buy at my house for 18 days and open the bottle, it tastes the same. But again, it's a subjective matter. Some consumers would find that Montana's milk tastes better because it's fresher, it's kept in storage for fewer days. So what if this is the case? I mean, even if it is true that milk is fresher, tastes better on the short sell-by date, the key point is here that consumers are paying for a higher price for this freshness. And right now, they don't have a choice. Okay, so this rule kind of enforces consumers to pay for this higher price. And I do a lot of research on low-income households, and I know they are price sensitive. That means each dollar matters for them. So every time if you go to grocery shopping, every time you pay $1 or $2 more for milk. This adds up. If we are looking at several years, you're going to be paying hundreds of dollars more. So there are some consumers who might be willing to take a 20-day sell-by date as long as it's cheaper. Okay, so some consumers might be willing to pay for this premium, but some others may not be willing to pay this premium. But right now they don't have a choice. So in economics, it would be better outcome if consumers are offered different options. And we should just let them decide whether they want a short sell-by date or longer sell-by date. If we have different products in the market, consumers can choose. So that's about consumers. Now I'm going to spend some more time on retailers and producers. So the implications for our longer sell-by date for retailers is that it would benefit small retailers. Okay, not necessarily for big retailers because milk is a loss leading product. So large retail chains like Walmart, they would use this loss leading strategy to try to get more market share. Small or big, retailers don't make big profits from selling milk. Most of them will have a loss from selling milk. But bigger chains would be able to offer other products when consumers shop for milk. So they are making profits from other things consumers would buy in a shopping trip. And it is pretty hard for small retailers to absorb this loss. And that's why we see small retailers sending petitions to repeal this 12-day rule once in a while. We had this petition back in 2010. And most recently, in April this year, we have another petition from Montana Food Distributors Association trying to repeal this rule. So if we have a longer sell-by date, it's pretty clear that it's going to benefit the small retailers, but not necessarily for big ones, okay? Because it will undermine their loss-leading strategy. Okay. Now, how about for processors? I mean, this is probably where we will see a large negative impact on in-state distributors. So if we don't distinguish between out-of-state or in-state distributors, if we are just seeing the distributors as a whole group, then academic research has shown that a longer sell-by date would make it less costly to produce and distribute milk. So it's as a whole group, they will benefit from a longer sell-by date. But it's pretty important to point out the difference between in-state and out-of-state distributors. Okay, so the difference is that this longer sell-by date would benefit out-of-state milk distributors more. And relatively speaking, it would have a negative impact on in-state distributors. So this kind of more detailed information about milk processing sector in Montana right now is that we have, I mean, this number comes from a white paper prepared for the legislature in 2014. And back then, we had 79 distributors licensed in Montana. 49 of them are out of state, and only 30 are in state. And that tells us that we actually have a larger number of out of state distributors. Okay? But 92% of milk consumed in Montana is actually produced in Montana. Okay, so that means even though we have a larger number of out-of-state distributors, they relatively have a small market share. Okay, so they are trying hard to get into this market, and one of the barricades they face is the short sell-by date, because they have to spend a couple of days on the road transporting milk from other states to Montana, right? So they have a small market share. Now, you might be thinking that, okay, 90% of the milk is produced by Montana processors. So we have a large market share. Maybe it's not a problem for us if we repeal this regulation, but the actual story goes the other way. Now, because out-of-state distributors have a small market share, they have potential to expand their market. Okay, so under a longer sell-by date, they could expand their market share from 8% to 10 or maybe 20%. So this is where really the in-state distributors get worried about the change of this law. And okay, so next, I'm going to talk about dairy farms. So the first point I want to make is that farmers will be impacted by the change of law more through quantity, less through prices. So if we look at this farm level milk price in Montana and Idaho, okay, this is a price farmers receive. We see that they basically receive the same price, and so for some years, Montana dairy farmers are receiving a lower price than Idaho dairy farmers. So if you remember what I showed at the beginning of the presentation, consumers are paying a lot more expensive milk at retail. But on the other hand, dairy farmers in Montana are receiving the same price as in Idaho. So that means the price premiums paid by consumers does not go to farmers. It goes to the processing and retail stages. So on the other hand, that means if we change this law, dairy farmers should worry less about the price, because we all know that farm level milk price is regulated. We have this federal level marketing order, and Montana and Idaho just happen to receive the same class 1 milk price differential. So we have the same price at the farm level. but we have different prices at the retail. But it is possible that farmers will sell less milk. Okay, so that is a possibility that will negatively impact farmers' revenue, either because consumers might purchase less milk, or because out-of-state milk distributors started to supply this market, and in-state distributors will just buy less milk from dairy farms. And this could be a problem in terms of quantity of milk sold at farms. If we look at Montana milk production over the years, we see a slight decrease or decline of milk production. And both in terms of million pounds we sell and number of milk cows. And if we look at the number of farms, we see even a sharper decline. Now we only have like 45 to 15 dairy farms in the state. So this could be a serious problem for dairy farmers. And okay, so a quick summary. A longer sell-by date would help consumers and small retailers for sure, and it can reduce food waste for sure. However, it may have negative impacts on in-state distributors and dairy farms. Okay, so we see this kind of trade-off when we try to repeal this law. If we have a longer sell-by date, it could help consumers, but it might have negative impacts. I mean, this is a typical situation for economic policy. We always have trade-offs. And I don't know if we are going to see the change of this law in any short period of time. I don't have any predictions for that, whether this is going to happen or not. But I would say Montana sell-by law has been a national spotlight in recent years. I have economists from Massachusetts and Pennsylvania asking me about this law because in this food waste research community, we know that this rule is kind of like the strictest in the country. And there is a nonprofit organization called ReFed, which evaluates each state's policies on food waste. And Montana currently receives a negative rating on this policy. So there is a lot of attention paid to this law. And what if someday in the end, I don't know when or whether this would happen, but what if this law is repealed? Now, what can producers do? What is kind of things we can do to prepare for those kind of changes? I mean, there might be some things that marketing literature could provide some directions, and I'm giving one example here, which is called product differentiation, that may potentially help in-state distributors and farmers. So product differentiation is a very widely used strategy in food marketing, and it's used to gain consumer loyalty, and often it will result for better prices. I mean, food products are not that different from each other. So it's pretty important to market your products such that consumers feel that your products are different, they are better. And we have good examples from marketing of local food, organic food, or reduced fat milk. And those are efforts that try to make your product differentiated from the rest of the market. And often you can get a good market share and asking for a little bit higher price. We all know organic food charges like higher prices. And okay, coming back to the sell-by regulation. Now, without a sell-by regulation, this actually opens a new dimension for competition, because now retailers and producers can choose whatever sell-by date they want. And in-state milk has an advantage in this dimension of competition. So why not just market this advantage, right? So I expect if we repeal this law, out-of-state distributors will likely use longer sell-by dates. I mean, they are those who would like a longer sell-by dates. And at the same time, what if in-state distributors choose a relatively shorter sell-by date? I mean, you don't have to stick to the 12-day rule. If the out-of-state distributors choose an 18-day sell-by date, you can choose 15 or 14 days. And you can market this or advertise this as a freshness of your product, right? So this strategy can also be combined with marketing of local food. But the key point is product differentiation has to let the consumers know that your product is fresher than out-of-state distributors. So again, I don't know what's going to happen to this law, but I have been told that a large distributor in Montana has used a new strategy, like we have a sell by and use by date. We have 2 days printed on the milk carton. And I mean, this is a pretty good practice. This will tell consumers that it's okay to drink milk after sell by. Okay, consumers may pay more attention to the use by date. And we also see the food industry has been being more active in food waste reduction efforts. We have food processors who join the USDA's food loss and waste champions. And it's just a trend in food processing industry that they also try to reduce food waste. I mean, it's not necessarily good for their profits, but good for their image. And maybe there are other things we could do to reduce food waste without changing this law, like donation of expired milk. Currently, strictly speaking, it's illegal to donate milk after expiration. So there are many things we could do when facing this kind of challenges. Maybe there is a middle ground we can work on to being creative in addressing those issues. And I'm sorry for running over time, but I guess I can, if there are any questions, I can answer them.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for that presentation. We did have one question come in, and then maybe I'll open it up for one more if we have it. So the question that came in earlier was, do these sell-by dates also apply for things like half and half and cream that are dairy products?
I'm not sure about half-half. I mean, it depends on whether, largely speaking, it should depend on whether it's pasteurized or ultra pasteurized. So if it's just regularly pasteurized, it has to stick to the 12-day rule. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, let me pause here quickly to see if there's any questions from the audience. All right. Well, seeing none at the moment. Thank you very much. I appreciated that presentation. Our next presenter is going to be Dr. Vincent Smith, who was a longtime faculty member in our department and recently joined the Emeritus Group. He also knows more about the Farm Bill than anyone I've ever met in my life. So we have the future of the farm policy, but the current short-term issue is the 2023 Farm Bill. So with that, Vince, I will turn it over to you and I'll get your slides up here.
Thank you. Thanks. So we're a relatively small group, and I'm perfectly content if you want to ask any questions as we go along, just to respond to those questions. I could take hours to talk about the new Farm Bill, or I could take minutes. And I only have minutes, so I'm going to behave and only take minutes. I see Bruce Maxwell's, Bruce, you're there. I promise not to be my usual long-winded self. Try and be short-winded. So there is no 2023 Farm Bill. That's done and dusted. Particularly the Republican caucus could not get its act together to find a farm bill that out of the House Agricultural Committee, enough would support to ensure it could be passed. So no 2023 farm bill. Well, what about 2024? Well, the answer is maybe yes, but probably no. I've written in the little handout I have, maybe no, but it's probably no. Here's what's going on. Again, because the Republicans in the House want to steal monies out of the SNAP and other nutrition programs to increase farm subsidies that go directly to farmers of specific commodities, enough of them want to do that that there is no consensus about what, within that caucus, about what a farm bill should look like. Moreover, there are no votes on the Democrat side for any reduction in the funding for the supplementary nutrition program, the SNAP program, what used to be food stamps. So that might not be quite a problem in the House, although there are plenty of House Republicans who have urban constituencies who would have difficulty casting a vote for a bill that would reduce nutritional support for low-income families. That held up any farm bill from coming out in the target date that the current chair of the House Agricultural Committee wanted to achieve, which was really originally late June, early July of this year. The House chair of the Agriculture Committee, Glenn Thompson, who's from Pennsylvania, recently has said he wants to see a new farm bill come out, at least from the House Agricultural Committee. That doesn't mean to say that it would pass as such, because you have to deal with the Senate, and the Senate and the House have to agree through what's called a conference processing on a new bill. But he is still saying in public he hopes to have a bill approved out of the House by March. Now, that's what the chair of the committee is saying. What the House Agricultural Committee staffers are saying is that they now believe it is most likely that there will not be a new farm bill different from the current legislation that goes back to 2018 until 2025. Essentially, what they're basically saying is we think that there's going to be such a disagreement within the House over the provision of additional revenues for direct subsidies to farmers through the major, what are called farm income support programs, that we won't get anything out. Let's wait till we have a new Congress where the Republicans are hoping their majority in the House will go up and that they will win the Senate, which they believe would then give them a chance to reduce food stamp support funding and use that money for larger subsidies to farmers. But it looks increasingly likely that given changes in election maps and so on, the House is likely, much more likely to turn Democrat, while the Senate may well shift very marginally towards the Republicans. And this matters for the Farm Bill because, again, you would have a deadlock over what would be permissible in terms of cutting, politically permissible, in terms of cutting nutrition program funding to support increased subsidies. By the way, almost all of which would go to large, very financially successful farms and, frankly, high-income, high-wealth farm households. There's this misunderstanding of who raises the food in America. It's not little, small, poor farmers. Overwhelmingly, it's households that run farms, and those households have higher incomes and much, much higher wealth than the average household. So there's the political conundrum there. So overall, we are very, it seems, unlikely right this minute, or not very likely is perhaps a better way of phrasing it. We are not very likely to have a new farm bill in 2024. We're much more likely to get an extension of current law beyond. That means, by the way, current law means the 2018 Farm Bill, beyond its current extension, which runs through September 30th of 2024, through into 2025. The farm lobby would actually, in some ways, like that, because right now, they're in the biblical Exodus world of 7 good years of high incomes and high commodity prices. And as one of the key advocates for increased farm subsidies, a man called Joe Outlaw, who's a professor down at Texas A&M, who gets about $2 million a year or more from the House Agriculture Committee to support analyses on troubles in farmland. He himself has said quite recently, it's a bad time to have a new farm bill because farmers are doing very well. And on average, that's certainly the case. That's what the data tell us. So what are the farm lobbies seeking? Well, their primary objective in all of the Farm Bill is to make changes to what is called the Agricultural Risk Coverage Price Loss Coverage Program that will increase the frequency and size of subsidies under that program. So this comes down to what I've named the reference price game. Each of 22 crop commodities has a reference price, and that largely determines, let me rephrase that. Market prices that are above the reference price for a commodity mean no subsidy. Market prices that are below the reference price mean that subsidies will be paid. The bigger the difference, the bigger the gap between a relatively high reference price and a relatively low market price, the bigger the payment, almost on a penny by penny basis on each bushel of production, of eligible, what's called production, that you get payments on. So going back to 2022, the Farm Bureau, the National Farmers Union, the corn growers, the wheat growers, everybody whose crop is covered by the ARC PLC program have said, we need higher reference prices. And everybody else has said, you have record farm incomes, which has been true, or close to record farm incomes. Why do you need subsidies when you have record farm incomes? And that's the difficulty that the farm lobby has in making its case. Nevertheless, the ranking members of the House and Senate committees have all said, yes, we would like to increase reference prices, which means, given what the farm groups are asking for, an increase in spending of $2 to $3 billion a year on average over the next few years, which is a lot, relatively speaking, in the Farm Bill world. But the problem is there is no money available absent being able, as it were, to steal what's called some of the baseline funding for Farm Bill spending from other programs. So where are especially, and let me emphasize this is especially, the Republican caucuses looking for additional monies? And the answer is they're trying to get additional monies by reducing spending on nutrition programs. That's one attempt. The other attempt is to go to the Inflation Reduction Act, which provided approximately $2 billion a year for over 10 years of additional funding for conservation programs that are largely focused on climate change reduction. And they want to take monies out of the Inflation Reduction Act authorized funding for the conservation programs, and again, move them to support higher price loss coverage, agricultural risk coverage programs. There are a couple of other wrinkles there that I'll talk about in a few moments. That train is not going anywhere in the current Congress, because in the Senate, the Democrats are adamant that there'll be no shifting of funds out of the Inflation Reduction Act conservation initiatives. And in addition, there'll be no shifting of funds out of the food stamp and other related programs that are Farm Bill related programs to support increased subsidies under the Farm Safety Net program. And it is fair to say that, essentially, if I want to put it crudely, the rich, which are the farmers who are all going to get most of this money, and they are relatively rich or very rich folks. The rich are looking to steal, in one sense, monies from the poor, because SNAP recipients are poor. Just to put this in a local context, the program that benefits the largest number of Montanans is in fact the SNAP program. About 115 to 125,000 individuals receive SNAP program payments, as compared to about 6,000 to 7,000 farmers receiving farm subsidy payments out of the approximately 28,000 notional farms that exist in Montana. And I use notional because, as you all know, many houses with 20 acres and an alpaca or a horse are viewed as a commercial farm from the point of view of USDA. And there are a lot of those farms in Montana. So let's go to the next slide if we can, Joel. The other question that has come up is, will there be changes to the federal crop insurance program? Now, the position of the farm groups has been, leave the current federal crop insurance program entirely alone. And if you had asked me 2 weeks ago whether there's any great likelihood of any changes to the federal crop insurance program, I would have answered no. But a week ago, this past Monday, the General Accountability Office, the government General Accountability Office, issued a report that excoriated the level of costs associated with the delivery of the federal crop insurance program by the private sector, which is now running at over $3 billion a year, out of a total spend of about $10 billion a year. Those numbers are Congressional Budget Office numbers, by the way. And the GAO, as it has in reports going back over 35 years, has provided evidence that using the private sector to develop, to sell and service crop insurance, it turns out to be more expensive than other ways of providing that sort of support. So there is the possibility that limits will be imposed on the amount of revenues that can go to private crop insurance companies and the private crop insurance sector. Restrictions that would occur through reductions in what are called administration and operations subsidies that run at about 20% of the premium that a farmer pays for their policy. And also other restrictions on other sources of funds, which are mainly what are called underwriting gains. The same report highlighted that a relatively large proportion of total subsidies that go to farmers with adjusted gross incomes for tax purposes of over $900,000. And the proposal is to phase out or limit any subsidies that are going for coverage of premiums to those sorts of farms. What would that mean for Montana? Almost nothing. The very few farms in Montana would be affected by that change. But these are certainly possible changes. Now, the other question that I thought was worth and important to address today concerns the conservation programs. And in a way, I've already mentioned that issue. In the Inflation Reduction Act, in last year's Inflation Reduction Act, approximately $2 billion was set aside largely for working lands programs that would be specifically targeted or largely targeted to the adoption by farmers of practices that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate the rate of contribution from the US agricultural sector to global warming. particularly led by Senator DeHoven from North Dakota, there's been a push among some Senate Republicans, and then also pretty extensively within the House, to take those funds out of the Inflation Reduction Act, put them into the Farm Bill, and repurpose them in two ways. Largely to increase subsidies under the price support, revenue support program, ARC PLC, by raising reference prices, and to some extent repurposing them to just support current programs as currently focused in the Farm Bill. So that would mean the working lands programs that where there's a mandate for at least 50% of all funds to go to livestock operations. And the intent of, by the way, that requirement for equip funds, for example, was to allow Iowa farmers and Indiana farmers to install heavily subsidized what are called CAFO operations, basically to reduce the runoff from pig excretia, to put it as politely as I think I can. So that gives you a sense of where things are here in terms of what's being pushed for. But the White House has made it clear that President Biden would veto a farm bill that came forward, moving monies away from climate change focus out of the Inflation Reduction Act. And there is zero support on the Democrat side, either in the House or the Senate, or essentially zero support for those shifts. There's also, parenthetically, a fair few Republicans who are not comfortable with moving monies away from climate change issues. Climate change is not just a Democrat versus Republican issue. It's more of a bipartisan concern here. That shift has been taking place over the last 3 years. Now, the last thing I really want to talk about today, before I answer any questions, is why the Republicans are so intent of writing bigger and bigger checks to the farm sector. And essentially, just to be crass, it comes down to buying votes. The Republicans now have 60 congressional districts which are viewed as rural. That's almost all of the largely rural districts now sit in the Republican column. And the Republican caucus, as on average as a whole, is willing to do a lot to ensure that they retain the farm votes in those 60 districts that are splattered across the country. Clearly, both seats in Montana, but there are seats in Texas, particularly the Panhandle and West Texas region. Clearly in states like Oklahoma, Kansas, and so on. And those are largely Republican. And Iowa is a classic example. So a party that historically has said, we care about fiscal responsibility, quite literally when it comes to the agricultural subsidies, are saying, we want to give you more, as much as money as we can find. And it's a very simple calculus. The more you can pay the farmers and claim when in your ads, when you go for re-election, that you're saving the family farm because you're getting more subsidies to the farm sector, the more likely you are to retain the farm vote. And I know that sounds very crass, but fundamentally, that's the world in which we live. And it's, by the way, the Farm Bill is what's the word I want? It's a microcosm of how policy is being driven and why we have such enormous federal budget deficits today, because you see that sort of process And it's now not just Republicans, it's Democrats and Republicans seeking in a wide variety of areas, from defense contracts through road building, through whatever, looking to shore up the supporters for their particular party. And with that gloomy, but in some senses, realistic assessment, I'm going to stop.
All right. Well, we had two questions come in while you were talking. And the first one, you might have hinted on it later. The question came in and then you mentioned it. But what do you see for traditional CRP program policy changes?
Oh, what a great question. It is a great question. Steady as she goes is effectively where I believe we're at. That is, I don't perceive there to be very much likelihood of any change in funding for the CRP in nominal dollars. Fundamentally, we're in a world right now where there is a push for moderating the budget deficit. There are concerns, there are economy-wide concerns on that issue. And as best I can tell, the Senate and House Agricultural Committees have been told you get no addition to what's called your baseline funding, which you currently have. So that means that any additional funding for CRP would have to come from somewhere else. If there were additional funding, it would most likely just come from reallocating monies within the conservation program budget. And to be truthful, the most worthless program in the conservation area is the conservation easement program, which does little good for any man or beast or woman or beast beyond the farmers who get paid very substantial amounts to adopt covenants not to put their land into housing or other non-agricultural uses, because its impacts are completely trivial. But there's only $100 million there. And while that's a lot to me and to you, it's not a lot within the context of a $500 billion Farm Bill budget.
Great, thanks. The other question before I open it up to anyone here that came in was RMA has some rainfall-based grazing products. Are they in the discussion for changes in the Farm Bill?
They weren't until 2 weeks ago, but those products are incredibly lucrative for crop insurance agents and the companies. And so the amount of monies that are received with it for policies sold to individual farmers are astonishingly large. So just to give you an example, over $500,000 has flowed to agents for sales of contracts in that area, according to the General Accounting Office. And they have the data, so I believe their numbers. So the change would probably not occur in terms of the premium subsidies the farmer receives when he buys such a contract, which is approximately 60% of the premium, the total premium for the product, the actuarially fair total premium for the product. Where the change would be made there is it would not stun me at all, because these are products that are very easy to sell that require no loss adjustment on the part of the companies to see some constraints on payments for those policies. And there's plenty of time now for the various interest groups who are other than the crop insurance lobby to address that issue, because we're very unlikely to see a farm bill over the next 6 to 9 months.
All right, well, thank you. Well, that takes care of the two questions that came in while Vince was talking. Would anyone like to ask an additional question at this time? And you're welcome to either send it in via the chat, or if you want to unmute and ask a question, that would be fine as well. All right, well, Vince, did you have any other comments you wanted to share before we signed off today?
Well, no. Well, I could make a lot of comments about individual programs. It would not shock me if we do have a 2024 Farm Bill. It would not shock me if it was just the 2018 Farm Bill extended for 4 years.
All right, well, that makes it easy in terms of education on what farmers need to learn about the new Farm Bill if we get that type of bill.
Indeed.
All right, well, Dr. Yu, thank you very much for your presentation, and Dr. Smith, thank you for your presentation. And for those watching today, mark your calendars for January 10th is when this series will continue. And the same login link and website that you came through today will also be how you access that webinar as well. So speakers, again, thank you one more time, and attendees, thanks for attending, and we hope to see you a month from today.
Thank you. Bye,
Thank
Joe.
you.
Bye, Vince.
Take care. Take care, you.